Hello everybody, it's Tuesday, February 12th, 2013. I'm Marty Owings and we're here live with Capitol Conversations, and I'm joined by my co-host Paul Gardner, former legislator and one-time racquetball champion. And we're also here with Representative Joel Mullery, who's in his 9th term and represents some parts of Minneapolis, I believe, yeah. Mm-hmm. What quadrant?
I represent about the north 2/3 of North Minneapolis.
Okay, so that you share Bobby Joe Champion, Representative or Senator Hayden. Are they near?
No, Bobby Joe Champion is the senator for my district and the one that covers downtown and the south end of North Minneapolis.
I knew there was some kind of relationship, Representative Mullery. Okay. It's hard to keep up after the redistricting,
right?
Although it's a little confusing.
Minneapolis is fine.
And so many moved from the House to the Senate this year.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, a lot of the news up here lately has been the governor's budget. Mm-hmm. Of course, he delivered a State of the State address recently. I wonder, as you listened to the governor's State of the State and you took in some of the reaction, where do you put that in the context of State of the States that you've heard? You've been here for 9 sessions. I think you've covered 4 different governors in your time. Right. So tell me, where do you put Governor Dayton's State of the State in there?
Actually, I think that this was probably the most forward-looking of all of the 4 governors' State of the States. Governor Dayton said that we have to face the future and not keep using duct tape, and he put forward a lot of new ideas, and as he said, he's not wedded to any one thing. He feels very strongly that the extremely wealthy people should be paying a little more than they are because they're paying way less percentage-wise than the rest of the people. But the rest of it, he's cutting. I've seen his budget. He's cutting things that are, look like they're fat. He's instituting analysis of programs so that we know what we should be financing. And I think that basically he put a lot on the table, a lot of thought went into this budget, and I'm really encouraged. I can, if you want to be picky, you can find something here, you can find something there. But overall, I think it's a really good approach to the future for our state.
Well, you mentioned being picky, and before Paul gets to his grilling, I wanted to mention to you that some of the Democrats have distanced themselves a little from a couple of things in the governor's budget. We had the majority leader here in that chair last week, and we couldn't pin her down. We tried. She was like Jell-O, but we couldn't pin her down on a couple of those things. And Representative Murphy's so nice, it's hard to get too testy with her. But I wonder if you...
I'm nice too, so you shouldn't get testy with me.
Well, we'll see how that goes. The Irish are always like that. But as you say, well, as you articulated, some things you can get a little picky with. What about the tax on clothing? This $500 across the board property tax rebate that gives the same amount of money to a millionaire as it does to a single mom, making ends meet, and of course the sales tax. Where do you stand on those things, Representative Mullery?
Well, again, I think they're all on the table, and I think they're fair to be on the table. I think that in actuality, the clothing tax works out not to be necessarily regressive. It's especially when you tax over $100 or over $200. I don't think that's, if people understand that and think about it, I think your average person is probably not going to be that upset about it once they analyze what it really does. The $500 is, again, that's with regard to your property tax. So I don't think that that's necessarily regressive on its face. If you're a millionaire or multi-millionaire, you probably pay a lot more in property tax than the person you were talking about, a single mother, I think you said. So I don't think he's really going to be, I don't think the people are going to be upset with what he's done when they actually analyze it. There's always the sticker shock, and the media has to get out what it really does, not just tax clothing.
Let me ask you about, or in the Star Tribune, their editorial recently said there were more negatives than positives in the governor's tax reform proposal, and they specifically cited expanding the sales tax to some services, including legal and accounting services. There's a progressive taxation argument there, and the idea of broadening the sales tax has been appealing to a lot of tax experts who say we're more of a service economy than a product economy than we used to be. But the business community is arguing, and the Star Tribune argued, that those are business-to-business costs which get passed on to consumers, and Senator Hand made that case with us last week. How do you feel about taxing legal services?
As an attorney?
Representative Mullery, Esquire.
I think that it's all part of what we have to look into. You know, if I should be taxed on the services I provide, then if we're going to tax everybody, maybe we should be doing that. I think you're right, Paul, that it's questionable as to if that's progressive, because if you're taxing people when they're in their most need, generally you're hitting them with tax, and especially the poor who already have a hard time funding legal services.
Well, I'm sorry, I was actually saying, for my time on the tax committee, I remember the argument being the majority of expense on legal and accounting services tend to be for people who have means. There probably are people who aren't, but.
Okay, there is for means, but if you distinguish between business services and other legal services, the tax that is proposed is almost equal, the revenue we get from it. And I think there is an argument that we definitely have to look into, that will it drive law firms or architecture firms or engineering firms or accounting firms out of the state? I doubt that very highly. I don't think so, but it certainly has to be analyzed. And as Governor Dayton said, the business community came to him and said, we need sales tax on all services. But then when he put down all service, they said, well, we didn't mean on us. And
well,
you
said something that is sort of contraindicates what everyone's coming to the Capitol to say. You said as long as everybody's in, and if everybody's doing something, that it makes it a little more acceptable. But now every interest group around who's going to be affected, whose stuff is either going to cost more or some exemption might get taken away, is now coming to say, we perform this vital function. What do you say to that as a legislator when you have 50 of them coming in during the course of the session? Grin and bear it? Or?
I try to get them to look at the reality of this state always used to invest in education, invested in having people really well trained, and we recruited a lot of businesses. We have the highest per capita Fortune 500 companies here. And it's not because of low taxes. It's because we have a great workforce here in Minnesota, well-trained. The Republicans in the first half of the century up to 1970, after that, Democratic leadership on education. I think that we have to continue that, and we all have to be part of that. The success of Minnesota is based on the success of all of us.
So if the governor's budget came up on the whole, you'd probably vote for it tomorrow?
If it came up right now?
Yeah.
Boy, I haven't even seen the individual things. I'm not going to vote for anything,
well,
but I don't know.
And I think the budget's about that thick, actually. So
I think that's only, I think one of the committees has what you indicated, that thick. And that's just the add-ons and changes.
But conceptually, though, all the pieces of some taxes going up, some being taxed that weren't taxed before, some going down, you generally would say that there's some merit there, conceptually.
Absolutely. I think the governor put a lot of thought into this budget, and I think we have the duty to analyze it, but I'm very positive overall on it. I think he's,
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think somebody had to step up and say, you know, we can't keep patching things together. We've got to look at the future. And he did it. And he had the courage to go out and do it.
Yeah, I think the Republicans, to be fair, have criticized that some parts of the governor's budget don't do that. That they, I'm thinking of the 1.2 million or whatever. That's basically a borrowing or a shifting within the governor's budget. And it seems like a small amount when you're looking at a $2.2 billion budget or whatever, but nonetheless, it's gotten some criticism, to be fair. No reaction to that?
I'm sure that the Republicans can find something that's a valid criticism.
Yeah, they did
out of all that.
Senator
Yeah,
Han
I didn't see
offered
that.
the observation that the governor's proposal is probably trying to be too precise to the point where it's too complicated, and its net effect is kind of lost, and that there isn't any reform. There's more tax increases than, say, cuts to meet the deficit. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think I haven't analyzed exactly, and the difference between what's a cut and what's an exemption, you can get into all kinds of word games, and the Republicans are very good at that. Sometimes the Democrats, some are good at that too. So you have to look at really what's behind the scenes, what is something that helps the people that really need it in Minnesota, and what makes the rest of the people that can contribute to having a great state, what doesn't go too overboard on them. That's going to have to all be analyzed, and you can't just in a week figure that all out.
Well, before we get into what we invited you on to talk about, which is the foreclosure issue, we'll get to that in a second. But I want you to react to one of the things the governor said in his State of the State, which drew some attention and obviously some reaction from the GOP. The governor said, and I quote, "I want Minnesota to be a state which affirms that freedom for one means freedom for everyone, and where no one is told it is illegal to marry the person you love." What was your reaction to that when you heard that?
I was
Mullery?
very happy to see leadership from the governor on that. I think it's just totally appropriate.
Do you think it'll come up?
I remember in college, I almost got fired from a job for standing up for the rights of some of my gay friends. Then having a dance at Kaufman Union for gays was a big thing, even nationally, and I almost got fired because I approved it. But no, I think that that's something that's coming. There's no question it's going to happen within the next several years for sure, at the latest. So I think that it's totally appropriate on that.
Do you think that the votes are there? We've seen a lot of the leadership sort of saying, well, we're going to focus on the budget first, and that usually is code for we haven't actually found out whether we have the votes yet or not. I think certainly the House leadership, I think, would be behind it.
Meet Paul the Decoder.
He
helps us with that.
Since he sat in our caucus, he knows what goes on in our caucus. But
he knows, yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, there's been no counts whatsoever, and I have not. I've got a lot of other things on my plate. I hope that goes through, but I just have no idea what the votes are on that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about this. You've introduced some legislation and been co-author to, I think maybe in even last legislative session. I want to say, I saw your name on
foreclosure?
Foreclosure bills.
Oh, I've had some of the leading bills in the country that became law, and in fact, I remember talking
we worked
to
on one on mobile homes,
exactly,
manufactured housing.
Right.
And way back when Acorn was still going, a lot of stuff with Acorn was really great.
Right.
There was some rip-offs by a few people, but they had an expert on foreclosure around the country. He was stationed in their national office down in New Orleans, and he said the two of my bills that became law were probably the best two in the country. One was this counseling services, where as soon as they get and send it to their default department, the lending institution has to notify counselors. We've got a great counseling setup, but even more important, I got a bill passed which extended the time for the sheriff's sale 5 extra months. So instead of 3 months to pay up the arrears, you now have 8 months, and if you've paid down a third of your mortgage, you have 14 months in Minnesota. And he said to me, he said, "Joe, you know how good that is? Most states are 20 days to 60 days. He said they just celebrated because in Texas they got it to go from 20 days to 50 days, and we're at 8 months or 14 months. Most people get their job, a permanent job again, in about 5 months. And so you have time to get another job and save enough to pay off the arrears before the sheriff's sale, because once the sheriff's sale occurs, you have to pay off the whole mortgage, and nobody can ever do that.
Wasn't long ago that I followed the Jewish community action around in your neighborhood, and some in Minneapolis, where they were reaching out to residents to talk about foreclosure. Some of the stories we got along the way were pretty heart-wrenching, and some of the tactics that the banks were using to get these people out or foreclose on their property. Even people who had been in their properties for as long as 25 and 30 years, very close to paying off their mortgages, lost their jobs. Representative Mullery, one of the tactics the bank has used is called dual tracking. On one hand, they're negotiating with you. On the other hand, they're busy foreclosing on you. And the communication between these time periods isn't very good. Matter of fact, we had one homeowner tell us, Representative Mullery, that she wasn't getting any movement until the Attorney General of the state got in the middle of the situation. Can you talk a little bit about dual tracking and how it affects your community and what you've seen? How about the devastation first? What in your community is going on?
Let me do two things. First of all, you talked about the people that have been in a long time and then lose their homes. Well, a year ago I came up with an idea that was different, and I haven't seen it anyplace, and I do a lot of research around the country. And I had a bill in that would, if you lost your job and had paid down 10 years, you got an extra year extension before they could foreclose. If you paid down 20 years, you got 2 years. And the basis of that is the bank has been collecting from you and profiting from you for a long, long time. You shouldn't lose all of this effort you've been in just because of a bad economy, which actually turns out to be caused in large part by the actions of Wall Street, the lenders. So should the lenders profit from your loss of a job for what they caused? I don't think so.
Where did that go? Where did that go?
It didn't get heard last year, so I hope it gets heard this year. I've got a hearing request in. Now, what the devastation of, it's incredible. I look out my front door in the morning, there's a house right across the street from me that there's just a new person in after a foreclosure. It was vacant. The one to the right of there is still vacant a long time after a foreclosure. The one to the left of the first one is up for a short sale because of foreclosure. So,
and these aren't just people, they're your neighbors.
They're my neighbors. It's driven down in
know.
some parts of Minneapolis, north side, it's driven down the values. People have lost 2/3 of their home values just because of foreclosure. And there could be other reasons in there, but a huge portion of it is foreclosure. People have, it's not just the people that lost it, it's the other people who are paying on their mortgage, and they've invested in this property maybe for their whole life, and now it was worth $300,000, you know, several years ago. Now it's worth half that. I just talked to a person who you probably would see around here. She bought a home not far, just straight east of me, on the same street, for about $125,000. She's trying to get $40,000 for a short sale now. So it's just total devastation of the neighborhoods that's been caused by all of these banks foreclosing. And the last one, the dual tracking, I've had a bill in for 2 years and couldn't get a hearing on it, targeted right at dual tracking, and it would have prevented it. It would have gone a lot further because it would have required, right now banks don't, or lenders don't even go through their own modification programs, and they don't go through the government required ones, and they just send them to foreclosure. This would have had an affidavit that you have exhausted all of the possible programs for modification or alternatives and all government programs, and you have to have a personal knowledge of that, and if you file that falsely, it can be both criminal and huge penalties, not just the proof of damages. So that it's hard to prove damages on that, but when you're facing criminal charges, automatic civil fines, you're probably not going to do it.
Just before we wrap up, yeah, I was going to mention to you that I was going to ask you about, and we've got a couple Twitter questions waiting too, but what reaction, I mean, what's the downside of this? I mean, I guess what arguments are you hearing? Hey, hey Joe, why you got to be so tough on the Wall Street guys? They, you know, what kind of, you know, what are you getting as far as?
Well, that's kind of like saying to the, you know, the bully on the playground that walks up and beats up some other guy, and society says, well, we're going to go over and help that guy, and they walk over with a baseball bat to the bully and let him beat him worse.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, they profited. You have evidence that there was a lot of total criminal fraud, even a lot of civil fraud, things like that going on that caused this collapse. All of this securitization and lack of regulation, securitization, the tranches, the waterfalls and the financing. I'm an attorney. There's two courts, you know, in England there was a court of equity and a court of contract. Well, yeah, contract would force the contracts, but court of equity was higher, and you look at the equities of the situation. And who should society, it's not just the people that are being foreclosed, it's our neighborhoods and the people that, and it's not just in the inner city. Sandy County, a lot of areas of Minnesota are very high percentages. And so society is actually, there's a study done in Chicago about the costs to society, to other, everyone in the neighborhood, to the city, and to the county,
the state,
of foreclosures. And do everybody else not count and just making the lenders richer? No.
Well, in the Irish community, we call these things shenanigans. I don't know if you're familiar with the term.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Cliff Dahlberg, what kind of Twitter questions do we have for Representative Joe Mullery tonight?
Well, we have one that's sort of outside of the sphere of what y'all have been talking about already. And the question is, do you think that SF 377, the traffic safety camera bill, will be successful this session?
What do you know about that bill, Representative?
It's probably
sorry, I haven't
cameras at red
heard
lights.
of
I saw
that.
that was introduced.
Yeah.
I would guess it won't be. I remember it several years ago, maybe Paul, when you were here, it was on the plate, and it hasn't been around for several years, I don't think. At that time,
is it a
there
Fourth
wasn't
Amendment
much
issue?
support.
You know, with this regard to taking pictures at the lights?
There's a lot of issues on it.
Yeah.
There's even an issue of identity, and there's just a lot of people don't like.
Producer's giving us the hook, Representative Mullery.
Okay.
Mullery, but let me just add this one last thing. Last week the media dubbed it Gun Week up here at the Capitol. Now, I read a news story today that says there's more applications for permits to carry guns at the Capitol since the hearing. But tell me, are we going anywhere with gun bills this legislative session, or is there too much resistance from the constituents?
I hope we can go somewhere with gun legislation. I think it's terrible, the situation now on data. Can you imagine that the ATF, the Federal Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, where the national head actually is from here, Todd Jones, they have to destroy data that they get within 24 hours. Now, does that make any sense? It's absurd. We should be keeping data on these things so that they can track what's happening. You know, I'm from, both my parents were from farm country, and when I grew up, we were out in rural Minnesota all the time, and you know, you walk in the back door and there's a big barrel with the shotguns and the rifles, and it's just there all the time. So I'm used to that, and then, but you know, there's a different situation in North Minneapolis. I think the funniest one was, I was talking to the mayor of Milwaukee, and he said, you know, he found out that there's difference between Milwaukee and rural Wisconsin just on the word duck. He said if you say duck in Milwaukee,
Yeah,
and guns. Everybody hits the floor
That's
because
right.
they think guns are being shot at each
Yeah,
other.
right.
If you're out in rural Wisconsin, you say duck, everybody runs for their guns so
Right,
they can shoot
exactly,
the
yeah.
bird.
Perfect. Well, it's been nice to visit with you, Representative
Thank you.
Mullery, and I appreciate you being on the show and
Thank you,
tolerating
and Paul.
Paul's grilling.
It's
But,
pretty tame. But thanks very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
appreciate you coming on tonight. All right, stay tuned, everybody. We'll be right back with Don Gemberling, and we'll talk a little bit about transparency in the healthcare committees as those bills to set up the healthcare exchanges continue to move through the legislature. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Capital Conversations. I'm Marty Owings, along with my co-host Paul Gardner here, and we're joined by Don Gemberling tonight. Don Gemberling is a transparency and data practices expert, and Rich Neumeister, who usually joins us on this segment, couldn't make it tonight, but Don has graciously agreed to be here. I think you were at one time the director of iPad. Can you tell folks that that's not an electronic device?
Do you have some royalties coming?
iPad stands for something else when you talk about
You know,
that.
I've mentioned this a couple of times. We invented that name sometime in the 90s,
Yeah.
and I think that Apple ought to be paying the state money for using that name.
I think we got
So,
jobbed.
yeah. It's a part of the Department of Administration that has people who are very knowledgeable about laws about information.
Yeah,
So,
but the name, iPads, Information
Policy Analysis Division.
Analysis Division, and
I didn't have any budget, so we had to have a big name. So,
make it seem important, at least
Yep,
when you're called.
exactly.
Look, this is Gemberling from iPad. You give us the. Yeah, no, it's and also for some time a practicing lawyer, right? Am I wrong about that?
After I did the data practice stuff for a few years, I thought probably it'd be a good idea to go to law school. So
Yeah.
graduated from Mitchell in 1980. So
In 1980, yeah.
Yep.
So and you practice now, Don?
I consult.
You
So
consult.
yeah, I'm in what's called restricted status, which means I can't represent anybody, but I can still help people understand stuff.
Okay.
Means I don't have to go to continuing legal education sessions.
Oh,
So
well, that's nice.
yeah. So
So anyway, we brought you on tonight, Don, really to talk about this healthcare exchange bill and stuff that's moving forward on that. Now, I had a chance to talk to Representative Mary Liz Holberg, who's a Republican, working on trying to get some transparency built in the process. One of her primary concerns is you're talking about a governing body where there's 7 people making some pretty big decisions, and how transparent are they going to be on those? So this crosses, and she's working on bipartisan legislation, so it crosses libertarian, sort of Republican, Democrat ground. What can you tell us about that and what's going on there?
the health exchange basically has 2 chunks that deal with transparency, and you know, transparency is really about accountability in the government, at least. The first chunk is how the bills as introduced dealt with the open meeting law. Because the exchange is going to be a state agency and it's going to have a governing body, it presumptively is subject to the open meeting law. Well,
Meaning, it should, you figure it's automatically going to be covered, right?
well, yeah, no,
right,
yeah.
okay.
So, and you know, without getting into all of the exceptions in the open meeting law, the basic thrust of the open meeting law is that governing bodies at the state and local government ought to be open to the public, except for limited sorts of things. So, what's in the bill, and part of what Mary Liz and some other people are working on, are some really broad exceptions. And, well, I'll give you 2 examples. Anytime this board wants to talk about any kind of contract, they can close the meeting, okay? Anytime the board wants to talk about any personnel matter, they can close the meeting. Now, there's already language in the existing open meeting law that deals with some personnel issues where the legislature thought, okay, fine, sometimes governing bodies have to do that behind closed doors. So the exceptions in the bills are really broad and pretty discretionary on the part of the board.
Yeah.
So when one of my roles as a volunteer is I work with a group called the Minnesota Coalition on Government Information. We came up with a marketing slogan, we're the transparency people.
Yeah, good.
So, And you know,
You
part of
don't
what
make the stuff, you make it more transparent.
transparent.
That's-
Yeah. Oh God, you're helping me with my marketing. here.
Trademark.
So.
BASF
Yeah.
won't worry about that.
And so when I testified for the coalition, part of what I said is, you know, how do you want this thing to operate?
Yeah.
Because they, at the moment, and I understand there's some possible changes coming, they live off percentages of money collected from the insurance companies. Somewhere somebody told me like $30 million a year. So they never have to come here and say, this is what we're doing with the taxpayers' money.
Yeah, that
And
seems.
So an organization like that, I think you want the highest level of transparency
Exactly.
possible.
Yeah, you
Let
don't.
me jump in. I think most Americans are starting to hear what a health exchange is, and they're starting to hear legislatures and governors say whether they want to be part of the federal exchange or the local exchange. And the way it's being put as to what it is in the first place is it would make buying health insurance as easy for individuals and businesses as buying airline tickets on Expedia or Travelocity. I'm a little skeptical that's quite true. But I think most people would say, this is some sort of market mechanism, and now they're going to see that it's a government entity. Is there a private vendor that they're working with to set this up? But they're sort of quasi-state, or?
No,
I'm just trying to understand the context.
Yeah, the way it's set up is they are a state agency.
Okay.
Okay.
And is that common in other states? Or
I don't know.
is the federal government going to do that through their federal government? or
I have a feeling they have to be a state agency to be able to do the exchanges of information with the feds, because, you know, I think that's part of the deal. But keep in mind, I'm not an expert on insurance and exchanges.
But
you know,
you can buy private insurance via this government's entity that's set up.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
a healthcare exchange.
What I've heard in the testimony is this is a source of information. After it's a source of information, it's a source of verifying what you can get, how much you got to pay for it, which then leads to data exchanges with the feds.
Okay. So there's some it's sort of almost like a minimum set of standards for what the coverages are going to be so that it's transparent. So, okay.
Yeah, so, but once you become a state agency, there's certain behaviors that are expected of you as a state agency. And part of the problem that a number of people are having with this bill, in addition to the open meeting law stuff I talked about, I think as originally introduced, the bill wasn't subject, or the organization wasn't subject to auditing by the legislative auditor. What?
Yeah,
You know,
And what's the reasoning for some of this broad discretion? Has anybody ever said, well, we need this because of X?
generally what I've heard is this is an entrepreneurial innovation, and therefore we have to act more like a business than like the government. Okay, but you're going to be in the government.
And you're going to be using taxpayer money.
You're going to be, well, indirectly.
Well, indirectly, yeah.
So, it's also was exempt from things like the Administrative Procedures Act. Okay. What did you do in addition to being in the legislature?
Worked in recycling, and I
You
do
worked in
now.
recycling. Okay. If you were licensed by the state of Minnesota, they took some adverse action against you. You didn't like that adverse action. Under the Administrative Procedures Act, you can go to the Office of Administrative Hearings, appeal things, get due process, and that sort of thing, and they were going to be exempt from that process. So after a while, you start looking at it and saying, okay, I have some sense of where you want to be. I don't have a sense of why you have to be there. Why do you have to close any meeting to discuss any personnel matter? Many of the employees of this organization are in the unclassified service, which means they're appointed by some way of no civil service, that kind of thing. And that was another thing we testified about, that, you know, if you're going to have people like that, and you can go behind closed doors and talk about any personnel matter, where does that lead? Okay, I think Representative Holberg really got on to the right way of looking at this, because she kept saying to the people testifying from the exchange, why is it you're so special? What is it that you're doing, kind of back to your question, that makes you special?
So you're indicating you don't really know why they want this stuff, but you must have a suspicion of why that is.
Oh, you know, it's stereotypical kind of government behavior. The more we can do behind closed doors, the less criticism we're going to take.
But it's not something like private insurance companies saying, well, we don't want to reveal the inner workings of this stuff we're using with the exchange. You're suggesting it's a government issue.
Maybe.
Okay.
Well, and again, part of what we said is, you know,
I don't know if that's the case or not. I'm just throwing out a theory.
We're just speculating.
you know,
We do that in the media.
I know how political this thing is in a partisan way. And that's not where we're at, okay? But part of what we think is, particularly when you have something that's this controversial, you ought to have more transparency than less, because at some point we can really figure out whether or not they're doing what they said they were going to do, whether or not it works, whether or not people are really being served. And if you have all kinds of backroom dealings, you're not going to get there.
So what's been the response by the keepers of the exchange that are moving forward? And who are they, I should say?
Oh, they're, the one person who's testified a lot, in addition to the authors, is a guy named Turpin. He's a nice young attorney. He's the general counsel for the exchange. That's how he introduces himself. One of the things that I was concerned about in the bill is some of the ways that the Data Practices Act stuff is drafted. It may be a little bit of a stretch, but some of it doesn't make any sense to me. When I look at it and I say, okay, I think I understand what they're trying to do. This isn't the language to get to where they're trying to get. And so that's part of what we're working on too.
Well, Don, sorry, Paul.
I was going to say, what do you think the end game is going to be? Do you think you're going to win enough people from a broad coalition to your cause to say we're paying attention to this and we think there should be consistent standards for all agencies? Or are you the guy who's going to stop the health exchange in its tracks over this issue?
No.
Okay.
Part of what I've seen so far in the House, and most of what we've been doing is in the House, is changes being made to the bill that basically make it just like most other state agencies. If there are special problems that they have, there are ways to deal with that. The best example I can give you is the Hennepin County Medical Center, which is a public entity, came to the legislature a few years ago and said, you know, the healthcare business is very competitive. If we have to have all of our meetings and talk about marketing strategy and that kind of stuff in public, we're going to operate at a competitive disadvantage. If we have to reveal to the public some of our marketing plans, we're going to be at a competitive disadvantage, and the legislature fixed it. So, but they didn't basically come up with wholesale exemptions. They focused on what's the problem, we'll fix the problem. So,
well, I wanted to point out that Rich Neumeister on his blog, openmn.blogspot.com, writes
open secrets. Yeah.
Secrets. A lot of secrets, Don. There will be less public scrutiny, accountability, and transparency by the public for Minnesota insurance marketplace. That bottom line, if that bill went through as it is supposed to, because of those broad exceptions you mentioned. You used the same language that Mary Liz Holberg used when I spoke to her, Representative Holberg. Broad exceptions, they wanting broad exceptions. Now, presumptive narrow exceptions may be granted, such as the marketing one you pointed out as an example for Hennepin County, but I mean, is that essentially a way to skirt the law, though? Because you wonder if in the marketing meeting, since no one's monitoring, there's no transparency, if they're not discussing other things in those meetings that might pertain, you know.
Oh, well, see,
how do you do it? Because you told me at one time, do you presume they're wanting to do good, or do you know what I mean? What's the reasoning?
As of, I can't remember how long ago, it's fairly recent, there was an amendment made to the open meeting law that basically says, except for closed meetings between boards and their attorneys, all meetings have to be recorded. Okay, and depending upon what the exact issue is, that means that in a lot of cases, eventually the stuff will become public. That's patterned after something that was done here 20, 25 years ago. where local governing bodies came in and said, you know, we can't do labor negotiations in open meetings, okay?
Yeah.
And so the legislature said, okay, fine, we understand that. But we want to make sure that when you go behind closed doors, you really are doing labor negotiations. And so they required that all labor negotiation meetings, strategies, et cetera, meetings with the union be taped. And once the negotiations are over and a contract is signed, those tapes are public information. So.
Let me ask you a broader question. When I was a legislator and someone say, I have concerns about this bill because of this technical reason and this particular reason and this particular reason, again, I often saw it as code for, I don't really like this bill and I want to come up with any reason I can to kill it. I don't sense that here, but do you have any axe to grind on the health exchange, or are you sort of neutral on that issue in your organization, or that you volunteer? It's the principle of transparency in government.
It's a principle of transparency. We don't have a position on the exchange. A lot of what I used to do when I worked here, and I still do to some extent, is the Data Practices Act is very complex, okay? And much of its complexity stems from how it uses definitions, okay? And so language is real important, and what may seem like technical stuff to some people is very critical to how it operates. So there was a line in the exchange bill that it's essentially the core of their classification of data that says all data about individuals and employees of employers who use the exchange and employers themselves are private and non-public. Okay, that's okay. Then there's another line in the bill that has a very broad, it's in the open meeting law stuff. It says all data, all meetings at which private, confidential, non-public, not public, and protected non-public data will be discussed can be closed. Well, you only need one word in that long list of stuff.
Yeah.
All you need to say is all meetings that they want to close or to discuss not public data can be closed. Now, I'm watching your eyes and you're going, what is this?
Actually, I'm looking at the producer to see what we're doing on the time.
Yeah. So, you know, it's one of those little things, but sometimes
it's in the nuances.
Yeah. And I've seen too much of that because somewhere there's a judge, if something comes up, is going to have to look at this and say, what did the legislature really mean? Okay.
Yeah.
I can say sometimes the legislature doesn't even know what it was meaning, except for maybe one or two people.
Well, that's what happens when you have specialization. So that's why being careful about how you do this stuff is so important. So
great. Well, that's fascinating.
Don, that's all we have time for tonight. We're sure glad you came on, took time to come on and tell us. I know there's a lot of transparency issues going on at the Capitol, including its own transparency in its own meetings.
24-hour requirement for amendments on the floor. That's a switch.
Well, we're going to talk about that in
an
update. But just wanted to mention that if people want to find out more about the open issue, about open meeting laws and issues like that, they can visit Rich Neumeister's site, of course, at opensecretsmn.blogspot.com. And where can they catch up with you, Don?
MnCogi website.
MnCogi website.
C-O-G-I, MnCogi, yeah.
And in full disclosure, we should mention that Matt Ealing, who used to be an executive producer on our program, is also on the board of MnCogi. And that's full disclosure. So.
He's the chair of our legislative committee. So.
Yeah.
Very good.
So we will mention that. Now, we'd like to thank our guests. Of course, earlier tonight we heard from DFL House member Joe Mullery, who talked a little bit about what's going on in the budget and, of course, his attempts to reform foreclosure law in the state. We'd like to thank, of course, Don Gemberling for joining us, and Rich Neumeister, who contributed to some of our content tonight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at mncapnews, and online at Facebook at Minnesota Capitol Conversations. If you send us a good question, we'll ask it on the air, and if we do, you'll get a chance to win a Nexus 7 tablet, which we'll be giving away at the end of the legislative session to some lucky viewer or listener. And for more political news and analysis from the Capitol, don't forget to tune in tomorrow morning, every Wednesday morning at 7:40 a.m. to KFAI 90.3 FM, where I talk for about 10 minutes about what's happening up here at the Capitol. We had production assistance tonight from Cliff Dahlberg. He was our media coordinator and producer. Our producer is Katherine Loudenslager. For my co-host Paul Gardner, I'm Marty Owings. We'll see you at the Capitol.